Okay, thus far, this talk is focused on what white Southerners wanted to do in the Cherokee Nation as far as embracing new technologies to exploit Cherokee resources. The question remains is, how do the Cherokees feel about all these plans? So let's turn our attention now for a few minutes for what the Cherokees wanted. In general, most of the Cherokee leadership was progress-minded and embraced new technologies like milling equipment and blacksmithing. The Cherokees fully embraced the so-called Federal Civilization Program that was begun in 1791 by President Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox, with the hope that the Indians would embrace Euro-American agricultural practices, Christianity, and education in the English language. According to the Treaty of Holston, which established the program, the government's intent was to lead the Cherokees, quote, to a greater degree of civilization and to become herdsmen and cultivators instead of remaining in a state of hunters, end quote. The program allocated funds for the purchase of domestic animals and agricultural tools to be distributed among the Cherokees. The Cherokees successfully adopted white husbandry techniques, built grist mills, they built sawmills, hide processing centers, ferries and turnpikes, and leased out saltpeter mines. Most of the Cherokee Nation was not suitable for cotton because of the short growing season and rain patterns, but many of those who could grow cotton did, and they also purchased cotton gins. The Cherokees had engaged in thriving market systems with other indigenous groups for centuries. And after European contact, they rapidly expanded the commercial markets to include their new white neighbors. Among other products, the Cherokees raised huge numbers of hogs, cattle, wheat, and corn for external markets. They built their new capital, Newtown, or New Echota, at the junction of 4 roads that connected the town to the rest of the Cherokee Nation and where the major rivers joined to form the Oostenaula River. From this location, navigation to Mobile Bay was possible. It allowed the Cherokees to send large boats loaded with flour and whiskey to Mobile. After Long's navigation improvements were made to the Tennessee River, the Cherokees benefited from the improvements. There is no evidence that they objected to the river improvements. They recognized the benefits of the new technologies developed by the Corps of Engineers in improving river navigation, and even hoped that some of the obstructions on the rivers where they had built their new capital could be removed to improve navigation downstream of the new town, as well as in the upper country. In 1836, the Cherokees wrote several letters to the federal government in which they laid out their plans to further develop their resources and commercial prospects. Among other things, they proposed the construction of more ferries and roads, clearing more rivers for navigation, the development of marble and limestone quarries, and gold, silver, lead, and iron mines. The problem, at least from the white perspective, was that these letters reinforced the Cherokees' position that their nation was sovereign and the states had no right to extend their laws over the Cherokees. Although these letters and other Cherokee correspondence do not address railroads directly, the actions of the Cherokees towards white intrusions on their lands for the last 200 years, as well as a new constitution and series of recent laws, reinforced the Cherokees' position that any laws passed by states to acquire right-of-ways for state-incorporated railroads would be untenable. For many years, the Cherokees relied on a passport system operated by the War Department to control travel or settlement in Cherokee territory by whites and their slaves. Although both the Cherokees and the federal government wanted to carefully control the types of people who moved into or passed through Cherokee lands, both parties also wanted to promote new industry inside the Cherokee Nation. And to do that, passports were issued to individuals and sometimes their families and slaves who wished to set up new industry inside Cherokee territory. The Cherokees needed white mechanics who could build and operate grist mills, sawmills, blacksmith shops, and powder mills, and who could teach them new agricultural husbandry and building techniques. Although passports for residency were intended to be issued only to skilled people who the Cherokees had approved, the federal government sometimes abused the system and granted permission to industrialists who fulfilled some need of the government, but not the Cherokees. These included permits to whites to set up iron and saltpeter mines for the dual purposes of supplying the military and making a profit on the market. Another problem with federal control of the passport system was that many workers who were granted temporary residency in the Cherokee Nation were hard to get rid of after they'd lived there for several years. Beginning in 1819, the Cherokee General Council began to pass a series of laws that regulated the types of white people who would be allowed to enter the nation to operate approved industry. These new laws established national standards that limited access and reduced the possibility of corruption and conflict among the tribe or among federal agents about who could enter and establish businesses. Censuses taken in 1809 and 1824 indicate that the measures the Cherokees took to limit the number of white people who settled in Cherokee country worked. The 1809 census shows 314 whites living in the Cherokee Nation, while the 1824 census shows 215. This is a decrease of 29%. At the same time, the number of sawmills increased from 3 to 13, the number of grist mills increased from 13 to 36, the number of schools, which were run by white missionaries, increased from 5 to 18. This indicates the Cherokees were successful in increasing both industry and education without increasing the number of whites who resided in the nation. On the other hand, the number of black slaves increased from 583 to 1,277, reflecting the Cherokees' growing dependency on slave labor. On October 15, 1829, after an influx of gold diggers into the country, the National Committee and Council temporarily suspended the Treasurer's authority to issue permits for mechanics to enter. The flood of white men into the mountains made it difficult to determine who was there legitimately and who was not. Permits were often obtained under fraudulent circumstances for persons who were not skilled mechanics. The General Council suspended the issuing of permits temporarily until the matter could be studied. 6 days later, on the 21st, the Council declared a resolution to the problem by enacting a law limiting permits to 1 year. By declaring that they could not bring their families, the Council expressed its concern over skilled white craftsmen using their work in the Cherokee Nation as a means to becoming permanent residents. An exception was made for millers, ferrymen, blacksmiths, and turnpike keepers that had already entered the country with their families under the 1819 law. Although the Cherokees had embraced education and new technologies, they were determined to maintain strict control over all industry, commerce, and transportation in their nation. This was in direct conflict with the goals of most Southern leaders who dreamed of opening Cherokee lands to new technologies being developed in mining, transportation, and agriculture. The 3 decades leading up to the Cherokee removal of 1838 were critical development years for the U.S. in terms of science, education, and engineering. As the U.S. expanded west, leaders were faced with new transportation and communication problems. Military leaders were also faced with the additional burden of rapid deployment of troops and supplies to defend the expanding borders. The development of the gold industry in North Carolina and later Georgia came at a time when Americans knew very little about hydraulics or underground mining techniques, or even how to locate new mineral resources. To solve all these problems, American leaders looked for new technologies that could be applied to a variety of military and commercial problems. They recruited self-taught scientists like Truce and Fanshawe to survey mineral resources in Indian territories and to advise on internal improvements. Southern military and political leaders like Calhoun and Gaines used their connections with the Department of War to obtain scientific expertise from the Corps of Engineers. Southern states petitioned for assistance from the War Department in surveying and building canals and railroads and helping clearing waterways to promote commerce between the interior and the Gulf and Atlantic ports. Although the Cherokees had embraced white men's civilization program and adopted new agricultural and milling techniques, many whites still believed the Cherokees were too backward to embrace the new scientific and technological advances that the whites wanted to apply to resources in the Cherokee Nation. With regard to the fact that Cherokees still resided in the area where Fulton and Lumpkin planned to put a railroad, Lumpkin wrote in his autobiography, quote, "The resources of Georgia could never be extensively developed by a well-devised system of internal improvements and commercial and social intercourse with other portions of the Union, especially the Great West, until this portion of the state was settled by an industrious, enlightened, and freehold population." End quote. Another former Georgia governor, George Gilmer, explained his actions in ridding Georgia of the Cherokees in his 1855 autobiography when he wrote that the Cherokees, quote, "had no genius for invention and have added nothing to the stores of human knowledge or instruments. Stone axes and hickory clubs were their tools for work and weapons of war," end quote. Gilmer believed that the Cherokees were such a primitive race that with the exception of some mixed bloods, that they were incapable of the types of education and industry needed for the scientific progress that Georgia and the rest of the South demanded. The desire by Southern leaders to incorporate new advances in science and technology in the development of the South led to a new level of racism. Although many white leaders acknowledged the fact that the Cherokees had begun to embrace Christianity, education, and were capable of learning new agricultural techniques, husbandry, and types of commerce, some believed that they were not up to the challenge of adopting the new scientific advances in engineering that the white race planned to use to exploit their resources. Finally, the Cherokees had repeatedly declared their sovereignty and their own rights to control their internal affairs, including the right to regulate mining and transportation within their boundaries. The whites knew the Cherokees would interfere with their plans to build new mines and canals and railroads from the Tennessee River to the Atlantic and Gulf, and therefore, as far as Southern whites were concerned, the Cherokees had to go. Thank you.